Welcome to Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò at NYU. My name is Chiara Basso. I'm the communication specialist here at Casa. And I want to give you the greetings also from our director, Stefano Albertini, who couldn't be here. Unfortunately, tonight he's in Italy, but I know he's looking at us from far away. So it's a pleasure to see you here tonight for this event in partnership with Save Venice, with whom we already had the honor of collaborating in the past. Tonight's lecture, A City Chosen by God, Venice, and the Iconography of the Annunciation, will take us into the fascinating intersection of myth, history, and art. According to legend, Venice was founded on March 25th, 421, the Feast of the Annunciation, a symbolic alignment that shaped the city's identity as divinely favored and deeply tied to Christian tradition. We have a special speaker tonight, but I won't introduce her. Instead, I would like to introduce you to Irina Tolstoy, member of Save Venice, the Save Venice board, who will tell you about Sophia D'Addio, tonight's speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chiara. Buonasera e benvenuti. It's so wonderful to be together this evening with so many friends of Save Venice and Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò at NYU. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Irina Tolstoy, and I've had the honor of serving on the board of Save Venice for the past 15 years. A very special word of thanks to the Casa Italiana for hosting us this evening. We at Save Venice greatly value this collaboration and the ability to bring together our audiences who wish to engage with Italian culture and art. We're truly delighted to be here for tonight's event in our education series, which is the first talk in the Save Venice 2025-26 season of programs. As many of you know, Save Venice, Inc. is the leading American nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the artistic heritage of the beautiful city of Venice in Italy. If you'd like to learn more about Save Venice lecture series, membership, and events, please visit our website, savevenice.org, or on the way out, you can pick up a newsletter or a membership brochure. It is now my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker and my dear friend, Sophia D'Addio. Sophia received her PhD in art history from Columbia University, and she is a specialist in Italian Renaissance art and architecture with an emphasis on Venetian painting of the 15th and 16th centuries. Sophia and I first met as PhD candidates at Columbia University, where we shared many academic interests. It was also in this context that we forged a wonderful friendship, enjoying many extraordinary opportunities to study and learn together, and even travel together throughout Italy. While working on her dissertation, she spent several years in Venice, supported by grants from the Gladys Kriebel Delmas Foundation and the Renaissance Society of America via the Crest Foundation. Sophia's involvement with Save Venice began years ago when she was a fellow in our Venice office. She was the recipient of 2 fellowships at Save Venice, through which she contributed to the cataloging of the Rosand Library and Study Center, which is a wonderful resource for both scholars and amateurs of Venetian art and architecture in Venice. And Sophia also helped us editing the past conservation project entries on the website, another wonderful resource which I encourage you all to visit. Sophia also holds master's degrees in art history, music performance, which has played largely in her own work, and Italian. She continues to teach at Columbia here in New York, as well as in Venice, where she has taught at the Columbia University Study Abroad program in Venice, a wonderful program. In addition to her university teaching, Sophia is more recently the founder of Mirabilia Art Adventures, an educational platform through which she offers online art history courses, museum tours, private lectures, art historical travel itineraries, and more. And now, Sophia.
Well, firstly, I would like to extend my gratitude to Irina for this lovely and kind introduction. And my gratitude as well goes to, of course, NYU's Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò for hosting my lecture. È un grande onore. It's a great honor to be joining you this evening. And I'll just note also that my throat is a little hoarse. Every aspect of my professional life involves speaking. I probably should have tried to rest my voice in the lead up to this talk, but sometimes it is impossible. So bear with me. I hope that you can hear me all right. My warmest thanks also go to the staff of Save Venice, of course, for both the invitation to speak this evening as part of their lecture series for this upcoming year, and for all of the ways that they have supported my research over the years. And so thanks go to, of course, Amy Gross, Laura Seco, and Kim Manharis in the New York office, and to Melissa Kahn and Leslie Contarini in the Venice office, among others. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening. I am delighted to have the opportunity to explore with you a topic that has long intrigued me. From my first introduction to Venetian art history as an undergraduate student studying abroad in Venice, to my doctoral research on painted organ shutters, a small selection of which I will share with you in the latter part of the lecture this evening. I shall also take this as an opportunity to showcase a selection of works of art that have undergone conservation treatment in recent years and decades thanks to the vital efforts of Save Venice. And I've included a small logo at the lower right corner of the slides to which this applies, whether I discuss the restoration or not in the lecture. But without further ado, let's get started. The legends of the origin of Venice, recounted in chronicles dating from the 11th through the 15th centuries, are numerous, and each lays claim to an honorable heritage that also prefigures an accordingly extraordinary destiny, given the impractical, inhospitable, and seemingly impossible nature of the site in which the city was established. Venice was topographically unique in its development in the marshland of the lagoon, yet it was also unique in terms of its lack of Roman origins, unlike the great cities of the mainland. The Venetians thus sought to invent a past for themselves, so to say, as explored in depth by Patricia Fortini Brown in her Venice and Antiquity, The Venetian Sense of the Past. According to the earliest surviving Venetian chronicle, that of John the Deacon, dating to the 11th century, the watery city was founded by refugees fleeing from the cities of the mainland following the invasion of the Longobards. Later writers would identify the invading barbarians as the Huns, led by Attila himself, thus further distinguishing between the Christian refugees and their assailants, who were no longer merely Arians, a variant of Christianity deemed to be heretical, but full-blown pagans. Another legend describes the first settlers of the lagoon as noble Trojans, led by the great Antenor himself, who had fled their once glorious native city that was desecrated at the hands of the Greeks. And yet another tradition, recorded by Marin Sanudo the Younger, among others, pronounces the official foundation of Venice as the moment in which a group of consuls from Padua laid the cornerstone of the church of San Giacomo di Rialto, also known as San Giacometto, seeking to establish there a new Christian settlement, one that was not built upon the ruins of a pagan past, but which was dedicated to Christ from the very moment of its foundation, which fortuitously occurred upon the 25th of March in the year 421, around midday, give or take. And here's just another view of San Giacometto, rendered in pen and ink by Canaletto. Given the precision of this timing, some of these early accounts even comment on the horoscope of Venice. They identify the positions of the Sun and Venus in the sign of Aries, thus aligning the birth of Venice with the initiatory energy of the start of the astrological year. And we may recall that Venus, too, was born of the sea. Jupiter and Mercury, in turn, were in the water sign of Pisces, considered to be a portent of great fortune for a mercantile republic built upon the sea. Here we may look to Jacopo de Barbari's view of Venice, dated to the year 1500, in which Mercury, god of commerce, presides over the city, positioned closest to the Rialto district, smiling upon this emporium above all others. Sanudo includes a full astrological chart in his account, further locating Venice's ascendant at 25 degrees of Cancer, another water sign. Returning to the date itself, though, March 25th was a day that held deep significance, for it had long been celebrated as the feast day of the Annunciation, one of the most important moments of the liturgical calendar, as well as the calendar year itself. And Venice is not alone, actually, in celebrating its new year on this day, for Florence did so as well until the adoption of the Gregorian calendar. Yet it takes on a slightly different, slightly deeper flavor within the Venetian context. This sacred event, that of the Annunciation, is one itself of initiation. It marks the beginning of the history of Christian salvation, for it was when the Archangel Gabriel was dispatched by God to deliver the news to the Virgin Mary that she would be the mother of the Christ child, as recounted in the Gospel of St. Luke. Through her acceptance of this holy brief, the divine became incarnate. Thus, by aligning the foundation of Venice with the Annunciation to the Virgin, these early commentators similarly declared their republic one that was favored above all others, chosen by God, as it were, to serve a divinely ordained Christian mission. Venice thereby came to be directly associated with the Virgin Mary, who assumed the roles of both protectress and model. Like Mary, Venice too remained inviolate, unconquered by foreign powers despite her apparent lack of fortifications, further underscoring the miraculous quality of Venice's mere existence, let alone her flourishing. In fact, the waters of the lagoon that they were what served as the city's defensive walls, given that only local inhabitants were able to navigate its winding channels without running ashore. Bernardo Giustiniani's commentary on the mythic birth of Venice perhaps best helps us to frame the way in which early modern Venetians conceived of their own origins, of what they considered to be their heritage. Quote, "The sacrosanct day, March 25th, was chosen, on which the divine message was brought by the Archangel to the most glorious Virgin, with the indescribable bending of the celestial highness to the abyss of humility. It was then that the highest and eternal wisdom, the Word of God, descended into the womb of the most chaste Virgin, so that man, lying in the depths of pitiable darkness, might be raised to the most joyful society of celestial spirits. But indeed, there is no measure to the divine wisdom, for he who, on that day, in choosing the Virgin for the redemption of the whole human race, looked especially towards her humility, and wished also on that same day that in a most humble place and from most humble men, a start should be made toward the raising of this present empire, a beginning of so great a work. Indeed, of all of these varied and commingled origin myths, the one that was made ever present to Venetians through visual representations was that of the founding on the Feast of the Annunciation. In what follows, I shall first present to you a series of depictions of the Annunciation with strong civic implications for the polity of Venice, as discussed by scholars including David Rosand, most notably in his Myths of Venice, the figuration of a state. I shall then shift our gaze towards a selection of portrayals of the subject produced for other contexts and which serve different functions, showcasing a number of remarkable works that have undergone conservation treatment across the past several decades, thanks to the enduring efforts of Save Venice. Perhaps the most evocatively Venetian interpretation of the Annunciation is to be found in Bonifacio de Pitati's version for the Camera degli Imprestiti, the public loan office housed inside the Palazzo dei Camerlenghi at the Rialto, a work that has long been associated in the scholarship with this theme of the mythic foundations of Venice. Although the narrative today extends across 3 separate canvases, initially these were all part of a single pictorial support, as shown in the reconstruction here. Following the removal of the paintings from the Palazzo in the 19th century, the canvas was divided into 3 sections, and the central one was trimmed down further. The scene takes place within a classicizing loggia that appears to be contiguous with the bedchamber of the Virgin Mary, who is seated at her lectern in the right-hand portion of the composition, the heavy and lustrous green drapes of her bed drawn up behind her. Gabriel alights on the left, reaching out towards her as he delivers the divine message. Yet in the space between them, at the center of this tripartite composition turned triptych, is the most remarkable part of the scene. Here, God the Father dispatches the dove of the Holy Spirit through which the incarnation will be enacted. And all of this takes place against the striking backdrop of the Piazza San Marco, each detail carefully described by Bonifacio's brush, from the pinnacles and domes of the basilica to the Doge's palace and the distant columns on the piazzetta, to the bell tower and even Jacopo Sansovino's just completed loggetta below it. Not to mention the hustle and bustle of everyday life that fills the piazza with figures engaged in various activities. Bonifacio thus places Venice at the very center of the Annunciation, both compositionally and metaphorically, referencing her mythic foundations a mere stone's throw away at the Church of San Giacometto, while also anchoring the moment of the Incarnation in the here and now of the Venice of his day, whose political power and mercantile prowess is thereby divinely sanctioned. Although this painting shows us an Annunciation, of course, that takes place at the very religious and political heart of Venice, we may also look to the structures depicted in it for additional representations of the Annunciation that would have had a strong civic resonance. At the Basilica of San Marco, for example, a series of carved reliefs were among the many spoils from Byzantium incorporated into the decoration of the facade during the 13th century. And I'll just point out the 2 here that I'm going to mention to you, right? We have one located right here, the other there. So arranged in this specular, this mirroring fashion. And these include a Virgin orans, a designation that indicates the Virgin's open-armed prayerful gesture that we see here on the left, as well as a figure clearly marked as Gabriel, whom we see on the right. Although these distinct iconic images do not interact with one another in any way, their installation nonetheless evokes the biblical narrative of the angelic encounter on the facade of the basilica. The subsequent campaign for the further embellishment of the facade, completed from the 14th into the early 15th century, crowned the structure in a series of Gothic sculptural decorations, including the framing edicules into which figures of the Archangel and the Virgin Annunciate were inserted. And here we're looking at this edicule on the far left and this one on the far right, so framing the entire structure. Here, the figures are clearly in dialogue with one another, produced in the same moment as part of the same decorative program. Both kneel facing one another, and Gabriel lifts his hand in salutation while Mary gestures towards her chest in acquiescence. The bell that hangs above Gabriel, too, would have provided its own salutation to the people of Venice when rung throughout the day. Although it does not survive, we may also consider a lunette sculpture depicting the Annunciation that once adorned the southern entrance of the Basilica of San Marco, barely visible here on Jacopo de Barbari's map, as we can see zoomed in here. Within the basilica, in turn, we may consider the sculptural pendants of the Archangel and the Annunciate Virgin that are attributed to Marco Romano, a follower of the great Tuscan sculptor Giovanni Pisano. The dramatic backwards kneeling pose of the angel paired with the elegant subtle sway of the Virgin infuses the scene with a gentle drama, as do both of their garments, which fall in sinuous calligraphic folds, their borders tinged in gold. Particularly remarkable, though, are the wings of the archangel, which are themselves made of gilt metal, giving them a truly light and glittering appearance. Originally, these sculptural figures were installed on top of green porphyry columns that flanked the Palla d'Oro, the precious altarpiece of gold, precious stones, pearls, and enamels located behind the high altar of San Marco, and thus at the principal liturgical focal point of the ducal chapel. The Palla d'Oro itself was only revealed on important feast days. On the many days in between, a so-called weekday altarpiece, the Palla Feriale, was visible instead. Both were installed between these columns and lowered and raised using a system of pulleys, the marks of which are still visible on their shafts. Regardless of which of the two altarpieces was visible, though, the two interlocutors of the Annunciation would regardless have presided over the gilded images below, reminding all who beheld them of the prodigious origins of the lagoon city. The basilica was, after all, the official chapel of the Doge, and thus it was the site of many key ceremonial rites and liturgical celebrations throughout the year. We may, of course, consider the role played by representations of the Annunciation at the Palazzo Ducale, the Doge's palace, as well. In the largest and grandest hall of the structure, the Sala del Maggior Consiglio, a fresco once adorned the eastern wall, which is where the Doge presided over gatherings of the Great Council, the largest legislative body of the Venetian government, as rendered in this print dating to 1566. Here we see the Doge surrounded by his closest retinue, we could say, and here we see a rendering of the fresco itself. And this print dates, of course, as I mentioned, to 1566, which is only about a decade prior to the fire that destroyed the majority of paintings that decorated this space, necessitating their later replacement with works that are still visible in this room to this day. The fresco in question, painted by Guariento di Arpo in the 1360s, was heavily damaged by the fire, yet not entirely lost. Despite significant losses, the overall composition is still legible in the fragments that do survive, which are now installed in a smaller nearby room within the Doge's palace. The subject of the work is the coronation of the Virgin as the Queen of Heaven, surrounded by saints and choirs of angels. Not by chance, Christ crowns Mary at the very center of the composition, directly above the place where the Doge himself would sit as if enthroned, as the representative of the illustrious Republic. Venice is thereby crowned by proxy. On the far ends of this composition, as indicated in this didactic diagram here at numbers 14 and 15, the two interlocutors of the Annunciation would have greeted one another, framed by specular architectural elements, providing visual bookends to the scene of the coronation, while also providing a reminder of the event that set the subsequent history of salvation into motion. Even more intriguing, perhaps, is Jacobello del Fiore's Triptych of Justice, painted in 1421 for the Magistrato del Proprio, the Property Court Office, also located within the Doge's palace. Rather than a proper Annunciation, though, this work alludes to the subject through the juxtaposition of the Archangel Gabriel, depicted here on the right, with a seated female figure at the center. Yet the composition, and the subject for that matter, is rendered more complex through the addition of a third figure on the left. This is the Archangel Michael, who stands triumphant above the vanquished devil at his feet, a representative of divine justice. Returning now to the central figure, we may observe that she carries in her hands a sword and scales, the two most distinctive attributes of justice. Indeed, this figure is a personification of justice, but even more so, she represents Venice as justice. This is particularly apparent if we compare the work to its closest iconographic precedent, the sculptural roundel depicting Venice personified, attributed to Filippo Calendario, which is embedded among the quatrefoils of the loggia of the piano nobile of the Palazzo Ducale. Looking more closely, we observe that both figures are seated as if enthroned and flanked by lions, recalling the throne of Solomon, the just and wise king of the Old Testament. Both are crowned and both wield swords as references to their power. The sculptural figure is identified through the name inscribed behind her as Venice herself, an allegorical representation of the virgin city whose mighty rule over the seas was divinely preordained. In Jacobello's panel, Venice and Justice are further iconographically commingled with the Virgin Mary through the presence of Gabriel, who raises his hand and speaks directly to her, referencing the incarnation in his proclamation of peace. The work was signed by the artist and dated to 1421, almost certainly indicating that the commission was intended to commemorate the millennial celebration of Venice's mythic foundation. One final example that I will mention here of an Annunciation with strong civic implications is much later in date. Agostino Rubini's relief sculptures for the newly completed Rialto Bridge, designed by Antonio da Ponte in 1588. A wooden drawbridge had long spanned this point in the upper section of the Grand Canal, which connected the mercantile district of the Rialto to the Sestiere of San Marco, thus linking the two principal centers of power within the city. Thus, when the decision was made to replace this with a permanent stone structure, it is most fitting that its decoration should also point to one of the legendary sources of the city's power, or at least to the divine dispensation that it was believed to have enjoyed. Along the southern face of the bridge, the Annunciation transpires across the expanse of the waters below. The Archangel greets the Virgin at the left, while she receives and accepts the news at the right. At the very center of the two, at the highest point of the bridge's lower arch, appears the dove of the Holy Spirit. And although I don't have a detail of that, you can just make it out right here, right? This charged space between the two interlocutors, the space across which the incarnation transpires, is an integral part here of Venice's urban fabric, then as now, the very ground spanning almost miraculously across the waters. Having explored this series of images in paint and stone that most readily may be connected to the tale of Venice's mythic foundation on the Feast of the Annunciation, thanks to their strong civic associations, let us now turn to a selection of works that adorned different types of locations, from private residences to confraternities to churches, and which were intended to serve a variety of different functions within their respective originating contexts. Each of these works would have, in its own way, reminded its viewers of the miraculous nature of the Incarnation and, by extension, of the divine favor granted to their own flourishing republic, a point that I will not belabor further, but that remains nonetheless a filo rosso, a common thread woven throughout the remainder of the material that we shall examine together. Titian's Annunciation, now located at the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice, was bequeathed to the confraternity by the jurist and orator Melio da Cortona in 1555. It was the first work by a highly prestigious artist to grace the interior of their newly constructed meeting house. Although today it hangs in a position high above the scalone, the monumental staircase, and its pictorial impact is arguably diminished by the larger and more dramatic works that surround it, as we can see in this 19th century rendering of the space. The painting was, in fact, first installed, though, above the doorway leading into the Sala dell'Albergo, the boardroom, where the highest-ranking officers of the confraternity would come and convene to discuss official business. Yet prior to this new chapter of the painting's life, it hung within the home of Melio da Cortona, as indicated in his last will and testament. There it would have provided support for his own intimate, private devotions. And indeed, we can note an intimacy in the composition, from the proximity of the figures to the picture plane, to the tender introspection of the Virgin, to the remarkable still life details visible beside her lectern. Recent technical analyses and diagnostic imaging completed during the conservation funded by Save Venice from 2023 to 2024 have revealed that the work was likely completed by Titian in two distinct phases. The first around 1520 and the second in the 1540s, with many pentimenti or changes made by the artist along the way that demonstrate his creative process in developing both the setting and the poses of the figures. The work thus clearly reflects Titian's working manner described by Jacopo Palma il Giovane as recorded by Marco Boschini. Quote, "He used to turn the pictures to the wall, sometimes for as long as several months, without looking at them, and when he wanted to apply the brushes to them again, he would study them most carefully, as if they were his mortal enemies, to see whether he could find any flaws in them. And if he discovered anything that did not accord with the delicacy of his intentions, he treated the patient like a good surgeon. If it were necessary, he would strip away some swelling or excesses of flesh, straighten an arm if the bones did not fit the form well, or if a foot had assumed an improper position, put it in its place without sparing its pain, and things of such kind." Working in this way and reshaping those figures, he brought them to that most perfect symmetry, which is able to represent the beauty of nature and of art. And after doing this, laying his hands on something else, did the same until that was dry. And when the time came, he covered with living flesh those extracts of quintessence, making many replicas of them that only lacked breath. And here I'm showing you two diagnostic images on the left that reveal some of these pentimenti. We have infrared reflectography above and an X-ray below, as well as the reverse side of the canvas, which bears a series of charcoal sketches, which seem to indicate that, in fact, Titian did turn his canvases around to the wall for an extended period in his studio before eventually flipping it back around and returning to it to complete it. And I'll just point out, even though these images are a little bit difficult to read, I'll point out one major pentimento, one major change that we can see here, which is in the position of Gabriel's left wing that we see here, his left, our right. Right? So we can see that very clearly indicated here. The gesture of the Virgin, with her arms crossed gently across her chest, indicates both reverence and receptivity, which is to say, acquiescence to divine will. Although her gaze does not meet the archangel, her ear is notably quite carefully revealed by her drawn back mantle, emphasizing the sense of hearing. Not only does she listen to the proclamation spoken by Gabriel, but the proximity of the dove of the Holy Spirit, who descends towards her along a ray of golden light, is a further indication of the imminence of the incarnation. According to the early Christian doctrine of the conceptio per aurem, or the conception through the ear, it was believed that the Virgin Mary conceived the Christ child through the hearing of the pronouncement of the divine Logos into her ear. This is echoed in the presence of the partridge in the foreground, for this bird was also believed to conceive through the hearing of the male's mating call, thus rendering it a symbolic bird for the miraculous incarnation of Christ. Titian returned to the theme of the Annunciation many, many times, but here we're looking at one example dating to some 20 years later, rendered, as we can see, in a far more dramatic manner in his altarpiece for the Church of San Salvador, which was restored by Save Venice in 1990, together with its frame carved from Istrian stone and attributed to Jacopo Sansovino. Commissioned by a wealthy merchant named Antonio Cornovi to adorn the altar of his burial chapel, this rendering of the Annunciation is oriented very differently from the previous one that we looked at. The vertical format of the work places the two figures in closer proximity to one another, while they are elevated above the viewer through their placement atop a set of fictive marble steps. Little of the setting is visible other than the lower portions of the columns behind the angel and the lectern of the Virgin. We're beginning to recognize some of these canonical components of the scene. The entire upper portion of the canvas is given over to a heavenly cloudburst filled with jubilant putti, these little angels, and illuminated by the radiance that surrounds the dove of the Holy Spirit, which flies towards Mary. Here it is Gabriel who folds his arms in reverence before the Virgin, while she in turn lifts her veil with her right hand, another allusion to the conceptio per aurem, as well as a gesture associated with ancient bridal rites. Here too, there is a still life element of deep significance in the foreground. Okay. I'll have another sip of water. There we go. All right. Here, too, there is a still life element of deep significance in the foreground. Towards the right edge of the canvas stands a glass vase filled with water, through which the light passes without breaking it, a common symbol for the perpetual virginity of Mary, for she, too, remains intact. Moreover, the vase appears to hold a bouquet of flowers. Yet, upon closer inspection, let's zoom in a little bit further here, we can see that the brushwork is so loose that rather than blossoms, what we appear to be looking at here are almost tongues of flame. This reference is further clarified through the inscription that appears on the step just below the vase, which translates to a fire burning or glowing and not consuming. This refers, of course, to the burning bush that Moses encounters on Mount Sinai, as described in the book of Exodus, an Old Testament prefiguration of the perpetual virginity of Mary. A markedly different spatial configuration is devised by Paolo Veronese in his Annunciation for the Scuola dei Mercanti, a lay confraternity of wealthy merchants located adjacent to the Church of the Madonna dell'Orto in the northern sestiere of Canareggio, and we're looking at that here on the left. Dedicated to the Virgin Mary and Saint Christopher, as was the adjacent church, the choice of subject was thus fitting. Of all of Veronese's paintings of the Annunciation, this is the most emphatically horizontal in format, given its intended installation, of course, which was to be above the entrance door to the Sala dell'Albergo, an analogous placement, in fact, to Titian's earlier Annunciation when it was first installed in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco. And this may have influenced the confraternity's decision to commission such a work following the construction of their new meeting house, designed by Andrea Palladio in 1572. In the painting, the Archangel Gabriel appears in mid-flight on the upper left-hand side of the canvas, clad in shimmering garments in orange, pink, and gold that flutter in the air as he turns towards the Virgin Mary, holding in one hand a branch of lilies that signal her purity. And with the other hand, he gestures towards the heavens, towards who sent him on this mission. At the far right, Mary kneels at her lectern, once again with her body turned away from the angel, yet twisting around towards him to receive the news with both astonishment and acceptance, as she clutches her brilliant blue mantle to her and raises a hand to her chest. The dove is positioned closer to her than the angelic messenger, indicating the imminence of the incarnation. In the great expanse between the two principal interlocutors, a vast perspectival space opens up, as particularly indicated in the orthogonals, those diagonal lines that seem to recede into depth towards the horizon, that are visible here in the elaborate geometry of the inlaid marble pavement. Described by Daniel Arras in his L'Annunciation Italienne as a characteristic example of the Venetian approach to what he describes as a theatrical use of perspective in paintings of the Annunciation, rather than a purely theological one, Veronese practically creates a stage upon which the sacred drama plays out for viewers with great immediacy, as if unfolding before their very eyes. This vast space is also articulated through architecture. Beyond the loggia-like precinct inhabited by the angel and the Virgin is a garden that appears to be enclosed or at least framed by a Palladian architectural apparatus, which recalls a chaîne France, the architectural backdrop of a stage set inspired by those of ancient Rome. At its center stands a grand aedicule with a rounded arch topped by a segmented pediment, resting upon paired composite columns. At the very center of the arch hangs the emblem of the Scuola dei Mercanti, a hand blessing the cross. And we can see that right here. And then on the pedestals from which these columns closer to the foreground rise, we have additional coats of arms here of the commissioning families. The garden beyond this space recalls the notion of the hortus conclusus, or the enclosed garden that serves as yet another metaphor for the virginity of Mary, just like the clear glass vase, which we once again encounter here, notably, right? You'll see it next to the Virgin herself, yet with clear, what we can clearly interpret to be flowers blooming or a blossoming branch, we could say. We can see that detail that recalls the earlier one. In the remaining portion of my lecture, I would now like to turn to the objects that have been the focus of my own research, painted organ shutters. These generally consist of two paintings in oil on canvas that are mounted back to back on a shared wooden support, such that each shutter has both an interior side and an exterior side, both of which bear figural representations. Given their door-like format, when closed, the painted shutters would protect and conceal the pipes of the instrument, and the images that decorated their exterior faces would be visible. These generally depict a unified narrative scene that extends across both supports when the shutters were opened. As is the case in this image that we're looking at here, which depicts the organ of the Church of San Sebastiano with shutters painted by Veronese, who notably also designed the sculptural case that houses the organ pipes here, and who notably painted everything else and designed everything else that you can see beyond the organ. And so we have here a wonderful example of a Gesamtkunstwerk of sorts, a work of art that brings together all the arts here. So the shutters were generally opened on these instruments before the instrument was to be played during the celebration of the Mass. And at this moment, the images on their interior sides would emerge into view. These in turn could either represent two distinct subjects, one on each shutter, or a single unified subject that visually operates across the spatial divide between them, that is, of course, occupied by the organ itself. This type of organ decoration was very common across northern Italy, and it enjoyed particular popularity in the city of Venice and across its mainland holdings as well. It will likely be no surprise to you, given the focus of this lecture, that the single most commonly recurring subject on organ shutters is, you guessed it, the Annunciation to the Virgin. Now, a dialogue between two figures maps well onto this bipartite format of the shutters, of course, but this is not the only reason for this iconographic prevalence. Instead, as I argue in my dissertation, this is very much linked to the notion of the Conceptio per Aurum, which we've already introduced. Each representation of the Annunciation, and particularly those on the interior side of the shutters, would thus have provided a prompt to spectators to ponder the relationship between sight and sound, and to consider the special efficacy of the sense of hearing as related to the incarnation of the Holy Word. The earliest surviving set of organ shutters in Venice to bear a representation of the Annunciation are those produced for the Church of Santa Maria dei Miracoli by Giovanni Bellini, possibly also with the help of the young Vittore Carpaccio, who was then active in his workshop. These originally constituted the exterior side of the shutters, paired with representations of Saints Peter and Paul on their interior side. In order to better understand the illusionistic rendering of the setting, we must, of course, consider the space for which these paintings were conceived. The interior of this church, often described as a jewel box, is entirely clad in marble revetment, which is laid in large book-matched slabs in the upper register in particular. This is, and I'll just point it out, where we see these large slabs of marble here that seem to mirror one another, creating a butterfly-like or Rorschach sort of effect. Both the interior and the exterior of the church underwent a massive conservation campaign thanks to Save Venice between 1987 and 1997, encompassing the marble revetment, the sculptural decorations, the painted wooden ceiling, and the miraculous image of the Virgin and Child placed behind the altar. That was the stimulus for the construction of this chapel in the first place. Looking for a moment towards the raised presbytery, we can take a moment to appreciate another echo of the subject matter of the exterior organ shutters in these two minuscule half-length figures of the Virgin Annunciate and Gabriel positioned on the inner corners of the balustrade. And I'll just point out here again where those are located. See them right here and there, right? Greeting us, as it were, as we ascend up the steps, if indeed we were ever in such a privileged position as to be able to do so. Returning now to Bellini's canvases, which would have adorned the organ that was once located on the left-hand side of the presbytery, we can observe how the space of Mary's bedchamber appears to be a fictive extension of sorts of the actual space of the church. Here, too, the walls are lined with book-matched marble revetment. The rest of the room is both simple and sumptuous in turn, from the coffered ceiling with its gilded rosettes to the thick red curtains of the Virgin's bed to the delicate inlay of the lectern at which she kneels. There are also numerous apertures in the space. Gabriel steps through one doorway, while another is visible at the far end of the room, its doors flung open to reveal an exterior loggia and a view onto a distant landscape reminiscent of the Venetian terraferma. A window is also set into the left-hand wall with its own shutters ajar, as if to remind viewers of the function and format of these paintings themselves, which create a near-perfect illusion of spatial continuity when closed, despite the gap between them, small though it might be. A paradoxical quality that reflects to some degree, some small degree perhaps, that of the subject that they depict. And the organ, as I mentioned, just to clarify again, would have been on the left side here of the presbytery. Jacopo Tintoretto's organ shutters for the Church of San Rocco, produced nearly a century later, represent the Annunciation on their interior side, something that is not at all immediately apparent in the current format of the work. The 16th century organ of San Rocco was installed on the counter facade, directly above the entrance portal to the church, and it was here that the shutters hung until the early 18th century, which is to say they still were on the instrument, at which time structural weaknesses around the area of the facade threatened the collapse of the entire church. The facade and perimetral walls were therefore rebuilt in 1726, necessitating the replacement of the organ. And the shutters were subsequently reformatted as wall paintings by sewing them together to form a single rectangular canvas. The same fate was met by the exterior shutters, which depict St. Roch's arrival before the Pope. And in fact, this was the fate of many, many sets of organ shutters once removed from the instruments that they originally adorned, in part because once a church was able to procure the funds to build a bigger and better and newer organ, the old shutters were no longer in fashion. And so, well, we can hang them elsewhere in the church. This happened very frequently. Thanks to the diagnostic imaging completed during Save Venice's restoration of this work in 1993, we are able to identify which portions of the composition are original and which were part of the 18th century adaptation, in that we do have the addition of further pieces of canvas here. Namely, the two lateral sections of the canvas, painted with columns, and the central triangular field where the dove of the Holy Spirit is portrayed. So tracing these original outlines now onto the central portion of the painting, we're able to reconstruct to some degree the original appearance of these shutters divided along the central vertical axis. Tintoretto's use of color and light is highly effective here. The rich tones of red and pink employed in the garments of both figures visually connect them across the great expanse occupied by the organ pipes, while the limpid blue sky streaked with gold in the background also contributes to this effect of a continuous shared space. Yet whereas we witnessed a near-perfect illusion of spatial continuity in the exterior shutters for the Miracoli, we may now understand how interior shutters operate differently. Any such illusion is immediately broken by the presence of the instrument between them, or perhaps we could simply say interrupted. And yet the pictorial devices employed by the artist create a powerful sense of connection regardless. This emphasizes the paradoxical nature of the incarnation and the seeming impossibility of the divine entering into the material realm, especially through the conduit of marvelous mystery, the marvelous mystery of a virginal birth. Here we may also further consider the role played by music in the unfolding of the sacred scene. These images would have been on view while the instrument was played, thus lending a sonic dimension to the spectator's experience of the images, but also reminding one of the sonic dimension of the Annunciation itself, through which the audibly pronounced divine word was made flesh. In the absence of the dove of the Holy Spirit, whom Tintoretto omitted in this representation, it is the music emanating from the pipes that in some sense assumes his role. It is the sound of the organ that bridges the divide between Gabriel and the Virgin Annunciate, traversing the distance between them and participating in the enactment of the Incarnation. Although painted organ shutters were most popular during the 16th century, they continued to be used in the early 17th century as well, before they were eventually abandoned in favor of more elaborate sculptural organ cases to house the pipes, whose volume precluded enclosure with painted shutters. One such 17th century example that reflects this legacy of the great painters of the Venetian Cinquecento is this set by Jacopo Negretti known as Palma il Giovane, which were produced for the Church of Santa Lucia on the Grand Canal. Following the demolition of the church in 1860 to make way for the construction of Venice's railway station, many of its paintings were transferred, together with the relics of St. Lucy once housed within the church, to the nearby church of San Geremia, where they still are located today, albeit removed from their original placement and function. The Church of Santa Lucia was entirely rebuilt starting in 1609, so replacing the earlier medieval structure, following a broadly Palladian design, as we can see here. And this period of renewal also resulted in the commission of many new works of art, including the shutters for the organ, which were installed above the high altar. The organ was installed above the high altar, which is indicated here in the diagram on the right-hand side of the slide, marked with an A. The Annunciation appears on the exterior side of the shutters here, for the church was co-dedicated to the Virgin Mary. St. Lucy herself appeared on one of the interior shutters, paired with St. Augustine, the founder of the order of the Associated Convent. On the left-hand shutter, Gabriel is silhouetted against a backdrop of billowing clouds. The Virgin once again kneels at her lectern on the right. Some architectural elements are visible surrounding Mary, including most prominently the variegated marble column set atop a tall pedestal, which is positioned directly behind the lectern. The remainder of the space is filled with thick clouds, playful putti, and a gilded orb of celestial radiance that descends from heaven, further echoed in the halos of the dove of the Holy Spirit and that of the Virgin. The sweetness of her expression, her humble, downcast gaze, and her gentle gestures reflect her response to the divine message, for it is not merely Gabriel who comes and speaks to her, but she who responds to him. Fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum, may it be done to me according to thy word. When originally installed, the immediate effect of this pronouncement would have been visible on the altar below the organ, which too was adorned with an altarpiece by Palma il Giovane, likely completed shortly prior to the organ shutters. This work, which is a current conservation project of Save Venice, depicts the Madonna del Parto, or the expectant Madonna, a highly unusual iconographic subject in Venice that is derived from apocryphal texts, including the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, which describes how the Virgin Mary sought out a place in which to give birth, quote, in which there was never light, but always darkness, because the light of day could not reach it. And when the Blessed Mary had gone into it, it began to shine with as much brightness as if it were the 6th hour of the day. The light from God so shone in the cave that neither by day nor night was light wanting as long as the Blessed Mary was there. And there she brought forth a son, and the angels surrounded him when he was being born. The overall darkness of the setting in Palma's painting is indeed striking, for it is against this backdrop that Mary appears to glow, illuminated from within and without by a divine radiance, as cherubs descend towards her bearing branches of olive and palm, signaling peace and triumph. And I'm sure that this effect of illumination will become even more apparent, even more visible, thanks to the upcoming conservation of the canvas. The ox and the donkey, in turn, appear by her side, and St. Joseph sleeps in the background, a reference to the virginal conception of Christ. But both this detail in particular and the overall iconographic subject clearly appealed to the patron of the work, named Giovanni Tiepolo, who was appointed to the position of Patriarch of Venice, the highest role within the Venetian ecclesiastical hierarchy, in 1619. Just 1 year prior to this, Tiepolo had published a treatise on Mariological themes in which he gave particular emphasis to the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. If we roughly reconstruct the original visual and spatial relationship between the altarpiece and the organ shutters, as demonstrated here in a rather abstract form, we as viewers witness the promise of the Annunciation above made manifest below, here below, right, in the Madonna del Parto. Recalling the uniquely Venetian associations of the Annunciation, therefore, this pair of images appears to reflect both the miraculous birth of the Republic and the enduring potential of her fruitfulness, guided, protected, and privileged through divine favor. Thank you. And now I believe we have a few minutes for Q&A. Do we? Well, in any case, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, either here or over a Prosecco.
Thank you. That was lovely. Really nice pictures and very eloquent explanations of them. And I wrote an article about a story in Boccaccio's Decameron. Do you know that one? 4:2, about a corrupt priest who pretends to be the angel Gabriel, and and the vanity of the Venetian woman who says, "Well, of course, the angel Gabriel is in love with me," and so, but it's a very civic story as well, and it's told by the Florentine Pampinea, one of the characters of the Brigata of the Decameron, and it's really about Venice. So I didn't have your knowledge at the time that I did it, and it just seemed that the Annunciation was the most prevalent image, and that Boccaccio was playing on that, and how a not very bright woman was able to completely misinterpret it and assume that the angel Gabriel wanted to sleep with her. But you didn't have that many things that Boccaccio would have seen, I think, maybe because Venice was constantly being remodeled, and so maybe there weren't that many things from the 14th century. But anyway, I don't really have a question, but except to know if you had ever thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful anecdote. Didn't really fit within the scope of my lecture for this evening. But I mean, if we just consider the various types of images that we looked at the Basilica of San Marco, the majority of those, or at least a substantial percentage, would have been there during his time. So he would have been able to see many of those. Yeah.
So I enjoyed all the paintings. They were very beautiful, but one of them was a bit more different than the others, maybe the Bellini painting. So this is what I realized. I saw that one was like less divine. For example, I saw that the Holy Spirit was lacking. I didn't see the dove, for example, and about the angel, about Gabriel, is like he was walking, he wasn't flying or floating in the air. Do you think this was done on purpose? Or maybe this painter, maybe he belonged to a certain special branch, more realistic?
This is a great question and a wonderful observation. In fact, this is something that Giovanni Bellini does in numerous circumstances. We can think of his paintings of the Transfiguration, for example, one in the Museo Nazionale di Capodimonte in Naples, in which we see, rather than Christ floating in the air with Moses and Elijah on either side of him, they are all firmly planted on the ground. This is something that Bellini does frequently. He suppresses the divine to instead give more primacy, we could say, to the physical surroundings, to nature in particular. And perhaps the best example of this in Bellini's entire oeuvre is located right here in New York at the Frick Collection. If we consider his painting of St. Francis, the stigmatization of St. Francis, in which, if you're familiar with the traditional iconographic approach to this, we often see a small figure of Christ on the cross, the crucifix held aloft by a seraph with these flaming red wings, who appears in a divine vision to Francis, thereby transferring the wounds of the stigmata to his hands, his side, and his feet. And we often see these direct rays of light that connect the stigmata of Christ to those of Francis. How does Bellini portray this? There is no angel. We don't see Christ. Instead, we see a tree along the left-hand border of the composition that appears to bend slightly in a breeze that has come out of nowhere, and a kind of a divine and yet fully natural light also falls upon its leaves. It is through nature in that instance that we have the working of this miraculous moment. And so I think that we can consider Bellini's Annunciation organ shutters, they're not in a landscape, and yet landscape plays an important part, but we can see how, yes, he in turn is more focused on the careful description of this world, this realm.
I imagine. Oh, they're waiting for that. Just yell. I imagine that there's music for every occasion, and I imagine there was a special mass for the 25th, the Annunciation. And I'm just wondering if, I don't know, here, maybe there's a musicologist in the room who can answer the question, or maybe you know the answer. But, I would, of course, the music for the 25th, one would assume, would celebrate the Annunciation. There has to be at least one major composition doing that. But then I wonder about the words, let's see, what are the words? Behold the maiden of the Lord. I don't remember the rest of it. Well, whatever, but you know what I'm talking about.
The response of the Virgin, the Magnificat, or the address of the angel?
The Virgin, what are the words to the Virgin?
Yes, gosh, let's see. The whole thing.
I don't remember it either.
Gabriel's words a little more clearly than Mary's, but let's see. My soul, let's see. My soul magnifies the Lord, something along these lines. Do we have any Catholics here who can help? Right. But in any case, the immediate response, right, is let it be done to me according to your word. Yes.
Right. And I'm just wondering if somebody knew the music, if the interchange is somehow emphasized in terms of response, that somehow the two figures are, in a sense, chatting to each other.
This is a wonderful, wonderful connection. And indeed, I am an art historian, not a musicologist, but my research, of course, is in an area that exists upon the threshold between the disciplines. And so this is actually one of the areas in which I aim to do further research to discover if there are more direct parallels that we can draw right between the liturgical songs, the liturgical music, and the decorations of these objects. That's great.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just in Venice, so a lot of it was quite familiar. But a question, in terms of this particular subject matter, the Annunciation, do you see anything that the Council of Trent and their attempts to control art then changed the way any aspect of the Annunciation was portrayed? I'm just curious.
Excuse me. This is an interesting question, and one that I haven't thought about as much in relation to these images. But indeed, the decrees on images following the Council of Trent, of course, emphasize greater didactic clarity, right? These are images that have to be clear and that they have to be effective, right? They have to clearly communicate the stories that are being told without all manner of additional superfluous things, which, of course, many of the artists that we've looked at, Tintoretto in particular, in his canvases for the Scuola Grandi di San Rocco, right, includes all manner of extraneous figures in his sacred narratives, the sorts of things that would have, of course, that Paleotti would have frowned upon. But it's a wonderful question and something that I'll definitely continue to consider. Yes, thank you.
Thank you also. It was wonderful, really interesting. The vases really got me. I never thought about vases before. But I'm especially interested in the lectern. When was that introduced as a theme in the Annunciation, and was it always present, or does it disappear or come and go? Because I can think of pictures, presentations of the Annunciation without a lectern, but it was so prominent in all of these. Is that something you explored? And I'm wondering if it had something to do with the fact that books had become so important in the Renaissance.
And in Venice in particular, yes, absolutely. I mean, it is a long-standing tradition. As to a point and moment of origin, that I have not pinpointed, but now I'm very curious, and I'd like to go back and take a look. The whole tradition of depicting the Virgin at the lectern is, of course, a reference to her reading the sacred scriptures. And sometimes we'll even see, if we see a book that is open, we may see some legible text that may show us, for example, a phrase from the book of Isaiah that prophesies the coming of Christ through her. So we have here these direct connections that are established through that, right? The prophecies of the old dispensation that then come to be fulfilled through the incarnation. That said, though, there are other traditions of ways of presenting the Virgin. One of these is the Byzantine tradition of showing her sewing. So working on the new curtain for the temple in Jerusalem. And so sometimes we'll see her with a basket of sewing notions, which indeed we did see in Titian's earlier Annunciation that we looked at. So that is another kind of variant to the iconography.
Just a follow-up to that, because we happened to see yesterday at the Morgan Library, they have a show about the Psalms through history, and they particularly point to one in which Mary is being shown learning how to read by her mother, and these are much earlier medieval manuscripts. So interesting connection of Mary as a reader, which we don't necessarily think of, but thank you. It was fascinating.
Thank you. And this is a good reminder to go see that show. I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all so much for your attention. It was a pleasure.